Just like in the past, in a banquet held to celebrate a recent conquest, Batu, son of Jochi, and eldest of the sons vying for supremacy, spoke first, proclaiming his position as the eldest and next in line. And just like in the past, Guyuk, son of Ogadai, spoke out, claiming his right as the son of the great Khan, and yet again, like the past, Buri, grandson of Chagatai, denounced Batu as the son of a murked bastard. When Ogadai heard of this event, he was angered to no end, and summoned the men back to Mongolia to remind them of their position as generals and Mongol men. After harshly lecturing them, he sent the men back to conquer Europe. When the generals returned, Europe was not ready. The Mongols swarmed from all directions like lightning, easily defeating the force brought together to fight the Mongols of 30,000, assembled from city-states across modern-day France, Germany, and Poland, to fight the Mongols. The battle occurred on the modern-day German-Polish border, and was over in the blink of an eye. The knights charged the Mongols, and the Mongols repulsed the first wave. However, the second wave seemed to cause the Mongols to withdraw. The knights celebrated and drove proudly as the Mongols fled. The knights, however strong their armor was too heavy for their horses to chase for long, and just as their horses tired, the fleeing Mongols turned on the Europeans and annihilated the force. The superior Mongol bow pierced the knights' helmets as explosives and ancient versions of tear gas erupted around them. The combined forces of Europe's strongest armies were annihilated in an instant. Shortly after the battle, the Mongols left the Polish and German cities to return to their main objective, Hungary. The Mongols would repeat the same that they had on previous armies. After fleeing for days, the Mongols turned to find the entire Hungarian force camped together with a fenced wall surrounding them. Catapults were pulled up to the camp, and noxious gases were flung into the European camp. As the men fled, they found that they were encircled by the Mongols in every direction but for one hole in the Mongol force. The Hungarians fled through that hole, and as they fled, they broke rank. Each man fled for himself, and the Mongols swept up the Hungarians with ease. The Mongols had ended the European night. Heavily armored men on horses would never return to Europe, as the Mongols had killed them all and introduced gunpowder to them. The Dark Ages were burnt by the Mongols, and from the ashes would rise the Renaissance, and the European fascination with this new world to the east, which would later lead to the discovery of America. The rest of Europe lay terrified. Their armies destroyed, and with nothing standing in the way of total conquest of Europe by the Mongols, the arrival of Mongol scouting parties in Germany shortly after the conquest of Hungary caused the Europeans to panic in terror. But just as the Mongols neared Western Europe, and one of the biggest events in world history, Ogadai, Great Khan, died. As soon as word reached them, the Mongols in Europe immediately returned to Mongolia. As in Mongol tradition, the death of a Khan requires the presence of all Mongols of importance to return home in order to properly vote in the Kurultai to elect the next Khan. In this legendary timing, Europe would be saved, given the knowledge of gunpowder and other Chinese and Muslim innovations, and spared total annihilation, as would happen in the Middle East and Asia. After the death of Ogadai, his wife, Torajin, ruled Mongolia while his successor was being chosen. However, she had been ruling practically for many years, as Ogadai slowly faded away from politics after his unimpressive bouts into China. She ruled the largest continuous empire the world had ever seen, and made decisions that changed the world as we know it. Through her effort, she invited delegates from all corners of the empire, from France to Vietnam, to support her son, Guyuk, as the next in line for the throne of Great Khan. Guyuk began his rule by eliminating his rivals, and those he suspected of not truly allying to him. He killed his great-uncle Temujin Ochigan, the last surviving brother of Genghis, and most of his cousins, and the Mongol Empire fell into a state of backstabbing and political insecurity. He moved westward under the pretext of a great hunt, but in reality was moving out to kill his cousin Batu and take his territory in Eastern Europe, and then press further into Europe as he believed it to be a promising target for conquest. However, shortly after leaving for Europe, Guyuk mysteriously died, months after coming into power. Seeing her chance, Sorkatani, wife of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, stepped into the Mongol Game of Thrones. Batu called for a Kurultai in the Tianshan Mountains outside of Mongolia, electing Monk Kong, Sorkatani's eldest son, as Great Khan. Ogadai's family denounced the Kurultai, claiming its illegitimacy on the grounds that it was held outside of Mongolia. Batu sent a force of 30,000 to guard Sorkatani to the birthplace of Genghis, to hold another election. This time, no one could refuse the Kurultai. However, in the celebration not long after the Kurultai, the sons of Ogadai stepped into Mongkong's ger, and were chained and arrested. Monk had already received word that the prince's act was a ruse, and that they had a force nearby the festival ready to kill Ogedai's enemies. Monk then began a purge of Ogedai's family and their supporters. Monk was not like the previous successors to Genghis. I follow the laws of my ancestors. I do not imitate other countries' ways. Monk was no drunkard and no fool. The Mongol Empire had returned. The Mongol family had shortened itself into two, the descendants of Jochi and Batu, and the descendants of Tolui, Monk and his brothers. Monk gave Jochi and his descendants Europe, and any conquests that they would have there, and set about himself continuing Mongol conquest. Monk sent his brother Hulagu, the best generals of the brothers, to the west, to finally capture the Muslim heartland and take Baghdad. He assigned Kublai, the most knowledgeable of the Chinese, to take the Sung and finally hold China in their territory. Hulagu sent scouts to reevaluate the Middle East and to recreate the pasture the Mongols needed. The Mongols moved slowly. Unlike in the past where the Mongols swarmed their enemies from all directions like lightning, the Mongols now had a giant force of siege engines and Chinese and Muslim engineers to use them. Along with them, they brought with them food for their new men. Wheat and rice were carted alongside the army, unlike in the past where the Mongols fed off the land. Along the way, the Mongols put down the areas that had stopped supplying tribute to them since their absence. They then encountered the Nizari Ismailis, the infamous group of Muslim Shiite assassins led by a heretical leader. The group came to be known as the Hashashins because of their frequent association with hashish, which eventually became the modern word for assassin. The Hashashins had no large army to enact their power, but the group held great power across the planet, with terror. Anyone who opposed them would die. The great armies of the Middle East never opposed their unconquerable mountain fortresses. In the previous conquest at the hands of Genghis, the mysterious leader swore obedience to the Mongols. However, when the Mongols left, their enemies had been destroyed, and the Ismailis rose to power in the vacuum created by the Mongols. The Mongols this time conquered the Hashashins for good by besieging the primary stronghold where the Imam lived and offering him mercy if he submitted. Subadai then paraded the Imam from fort to force the surrender of the remaining assassins. The Imam then realized after the final stronghold had been captured that he was useless, and requested permission to go to Karakorum himself and meet the great Monk, hoping that he would strengthen his ties with him. Upon arriving, Monk refused to see him, and the Imam and his men were brought out of the city and were stomped to death. Come back next time for the conquest of Baghdad and the fall of the Mongol Empire. Support the channel on Patreon and subscribe for weekly animated history videos.